The story begins in Italy, in the midst of a nation torn apart by war. It was a place where bombed-out buildings lined the streets and the echo of marching boots still haunted the narrow alleys. Amid the devastation, hospitals stood as fragile islands of hope, filled with the smell of antiseptic and the muffled cries of the wounded. Inside these institutions, Italian nurses worked tirelessly, their white uniforms contrasting sharply with the blood and bandages that surrounded them. Each day they fought a quieter battle, not with rifles or grenades, but with bandages, morphine, and compassion. Their mission was simple: to keep men alive in a world that seemed intent on death. Beyond the sterile walls of the wards, another force was present. U.S. Guards patrolled outside the hospitals, standing tall in their olive-drab uniforms with rifles slung across their shoulders. Their presence was both a reassurance and a reminder. They were liberators to some, strangers to others, yet all was a constant sight for the nurses who passed them on their way to and from the wards. The Americans brought with them a different cadence, a different accent, and an energy foreign to Italian towns that had been suffocating under years of occupation. Where there was once only the harshness of war, now there was the subtle complexity of cultural encounter. It was in this fragile balance that whispers began to circulate. People noticed the proximity of the nurses to the guards, the shared glances, the brief exchanges of words as they crossed paths in the corridors or at hospital gates. In truth, these moments were often no more than necessities of duty, yet in the watchful eyes of a weary community, they took on meanings far beyond the ordinary. A nod of thanks could be interpreted as something more. A passing smile could ignite suspicion. In times of turmoil, small gestures became magnified, distorted by fear and imagination. For the Italian people, who had endured years of shifting allegiances and occupations, such rumors were not idle chatter. They touched on deeper anxieties about loyalty and survival. Nurses were supposed to embody dignity, purity, and service to the nation. To imagine them forming attachments, even in rumor, with foreign soldiers unsettled the fragile moral order that held communities together. These stories were not spoken loudly at first, but rather in hushed voices at market stalls, in church courtyards, and among neighbors who had already seen too much of war's cruelty. Inside the hospitals, however, the reality was far simpler. The nurses bent over stretchers, cleaned wounds, and soothed frightened men who often cried out for their mothers in fevered delirium. The guards stationed nearby kept watch for danger and enforced order among restless crowds. To the nurses, they were simply another presence in a life already crowded with responsibilities. Yet outside the hospital walls, imaginations painted a different picture. People wondered what was happening behind those closed doors, convinced that intimacy had taken root where there was, in fact, only exhaustion and necessity. Imagine being one of those nurses. The long hours left little time to sleep, your hands red from constant washing, your eyes stinging from lack of rest. Every decision you made carried the weight of a man's life. And yet, even as you labored to save others, unseen voices outside were weaving stories about your private life. The burden of duty was doubled by the burden of suspicion, a weight as heavy as any wounded soldier you carried on a stretcher. In this way, war invaded even the quietest acts of service. This was the early context of the story, a quiet storm gathering strength behind hospital walls. It was not a tale of battles or strategies, but of glances and whispers, of perception and suspicion. What began in the ordinary interactions between nurses and guards soon spiraled into a narrative much larger than the people involved. Italy, a nation struggling to find its footing in the midst of war, found itself transfixed by a drama unfolding not in trenches or fields, but in the corridors of healing. And from this fragile beginning, a cultural tension was born that would linger long after the last shots of the war had faded. The rumors that swirled around the hospitals began as faint murmurs, but soon they grew into something more substantial. In a society already strained by years of hardship, even the smallest suggestion of impropriety could spark unease. Italian nurses, who had been trained to act with discipline and compassion, suddenly found themselves at the center of speculation. To their communities, the very idea that they might be close to U.S. guards was shocking. These men were not just foreigners, they were symbols of power, of a shifting political order, and of an uneasy liberation. The contrast between how the nurses saw their role and how others interpreted it was stark and painful. Inside the wards, the nurses viewed their relationships with the guards as nothing more than a matter of proximity. The guards controlled the gates, secured the halls, and at times escorted supplies into the hospital grounds. Conversations were often no more than formalities, words exchanged quickly and without hidden intent. Yet for those watching from outside, each interaction took on a weight of its own. A smile exchanged in passing became a clue. A pause in conversation was twisted into proof of affection. The difference between perception and reality widened with every retelling of the story. For Italians still scarred by war, the notion of their women engaging in personal ties with American soldiers was deeply unsettling. Many saw it as a betrayal of national pride, an erosion of cultural integrity, at a time when identity was already fragile. Others, worn down by suffering, felt a quiet fascination at the possibility of such connections, as if love could somehow bloom amid ruin. But fascination did not protect the nurses from judgment. Whispers turned into accusations, and accusations turned into an invisible trial that followed them wherever they went. Their uniforms, once symbols of dignity, now carried shadows of suspicion. Imagine the tension this created. For a nurse walking through a crowded street, the silence of neighbors could feel louder than words. Every step home from the hospital seemed to echo with unspoken doubts. For the guards, too, the rumors left their mark. They were trained to handle hostility from enemies, but not the suspicion of allies. A nod of courtesy to a nurse could later return as gossip that questioned their intentions. The simple act of standing post outside a hospital became entangled in cultural fears that no amount of discipline could resolve. In this way, a chasm opened, not of politics or strategy, but of human perception. It was a conflict between what was seen, what was believed, and what was true. To understand how these rumors took hold, we must look closer at the environment that allowed them to spread. Italian hospitals during the war were not simply medical centers. They were crossroads of fear, exhaustion, and shifting power. Nurses had been trained to serve without hesitation, to put duty above everything else. Their presence in these hospitals was not optional, it was essential. Yet, when U.S. guards were stationed nearby, their daily proximity became fertile ground for speculation. In a community still raw from invasion and occupation, the sight of local women working side by side with foreign men was enough to set imaginations ablaze. These whispers were not born from clear evidence, but from the anxieties of a population searching for stability in chaos. Italy had been torn between allegiances, first under fascist control, then under the shadow of German occupation, and finally under the arrival of the Allies. Each shift left people more uncertain about who could be trusted. Nurses, as respected figures, became symbols of this uncertainty. They represented purity and service, but also vulnerability to the temptations of survival. If they could be suspected of wavering in loyalty, then no one felt secure. Rumors became a way of voicing fear without confronting it directly. In small towns and crowded cities alike, these stories spread with remarkable speed. At church gatherings, women whispered to one another about the things they thought they had seen. In marketplaces, men shook their heads, repeating the latest gossip as if it were fact. No one could say for sure where the stories began, but they gained momentum in a society already primed to believe the worst. The background of these rumors was not love or betrayal, but the collective anxiety of a people who had lived too long under suspicion and control. Every glance, every gesture was measured against a backdrop of paranoia. For the nurses themselves, this created a cruel irony. They were often too exhausted to think of anything beyond their work. Hours were long, patients were many, and the emotional burden of caring for the wounded was immense. Yet at the same time, they became unwilling protagonists in a narrative they had not written. They were spoken of as if they were characters in a scandal, when in reality they were simply women trying to do their jobs. Their lives had been reduced to symbols in a story of national fear. This background of mistrust and rumor would shape the way their actions were seen for years to come. Imagine standing in their shoes. You spend the day wiping blood from a soldier's brow, stitching torn flesh, and holding the hands of men who may not survive until dawn. You leave the hospital with aching feet and trembling hands only to hear your name whispered with suspicion by your neighbors. The very community you serve doubts you, not because of what you have done, but because of what they imagine. That is the origin of this story, not a secret romance, but a society projecting its own fears onto women who had little power to defend themselves. Out of uncertainty grew rumor, and out of rumor grew a cultural tension that would define their wartime experience. The front lines of the war were far from these hospitals, yet the atmosphere within them carried its own kind of battlefield. While soldiers clashed in the hills and valleys of Italy, another struggle unfolded quietly in the corridors of medical wards. The rumors that spread about nurses and U.S. guards did not alter military strategies, but they reshaped the emotional terrain behind the lines. Hospitals, which should have been places of healing and refuge, became infused with suspicion. The air was heavy not only with the smell of medicine and sweat, but also with the unspoken weight of judgment. Each day, nurses bore the double responsibility of saving lives while guarding their reputations. This invisible pressure was felt deeply by the women who worked tirelessly to keep their wards functional. To them, the presence of American guards was simply part of the war's machinery. The guards were there to keep order, to watch for threats, to secure the fragile calm of a country in turmoil. But outside the hospital walls, their proximity was interpreted as intimacy. The contrast between the practical reality of duty and the imagined tales of romance created a quiet torment. Nurses often found themselves questioning even their smallest gestures, knowing that a simple word of gratitude could be twisted into evidence of impropriety. For the U.S. Guards, the impact was equally complex. They had come expecting danger from enemy combatants, but not suspicion from supposed allies. Their interactions with nurses were brief and formal, yet every encounter carried the risk of being misunderstood. A guard standing watch at a gate could become the subject of gossip before the day was done. These men were tasked with protecting both the hospitals and the fragile trust of local communities, but the rumors undercut their presence. Even in their silence, they became unwilling actors in a narrative that questioned their integrity. This tension did not stop the work of the hospitals, but it changed their character. The wards became places where compassion had to fight, not only against disease and wounds, but also against doubt. Imagine walking into a room filled with wounded men, hearing the groans of pain and the steady drip of plasma, while knowing that outside those walls, your neighbors were wondering about your private life. The battlefield was no longer just in the mountains or the fields. It had seeped into the very spaces where life and death were negotiated daily. In this way, the war proved that conflict is not confined to guns and trenches, but can invade even the most sacred acts of care. What emerged was a new kind of battlefield, one where victory was measured not in ground gained, but in dignity preserved. The nurses fought for the lives of their patients, but they also fought for the truth of their own service. The guards stood ready with their weapons, but also stood under the scrutiny of eyes that doubted them. Behind the lines, in the silence of hospitals, the war continued in whispers, in mistrust, and in the unrelenting struggle to separate fact from rumor. The impact was not written in military reports, but it was deeply felt in the hearts of those who lived it. It was a reminder that war leaves no corner untouched, not even the places meant for healing. The rumors that began in hospital corridors soon escaped into the wider streets of Italian towns. What might have been dismissed as idle speculation instead grew into a cultural question that reached far beyond the lives of a few nurses and guards. Italy in the midst of war was a country desperate to protect what little stability it had left. Any story that challenged ideas of loyalty, morality, or national pride became magnified. The thought that Italian women, particularly those tasked with service and dignity, might be linked to foreign soldiers, unsettled entire communities. It was as though the nation itself felt implicated in these whispered accusations. For the nurses, the consequences were personal and painful. Their work had once defined them as pillars of strength, women who represented compassion in a time of destruction. Yet now their reputations were burdened by suspicions they could not disprove. Every long shift, every late walk home from the hospital became another chance for someone to cast judgment. They carried their patients in their arms, but carried the invisible weight of rumor on their backs. The dignity of their uniforms, once a shield, now drew unwanted attention. What should have been a symbol of trust had become a fragile reminder of how easily that trust could fracture. The American Guards were not spared from these wider consequences either. They were strangers in a land struggling with its identity, and their presence was interpreted through layers of history and memory. Some Italians saw them as protectors, others as occupiers, but in either case, their actions were rarely viewed in a neutral light. To be seen in conversation with a nurse was to invite speculation, whether or not any personal bond existed. This strained the relationship between liberators and the liberated, exposing the fragility of trust in an environment already weighed down by loss and suspicion. Beyond individuals, the rumors also exposed the deeper wounds of Italian society during wartime. Communities had been divided by shifting alliances, and families had been torn apart by competing loyalties. In such a fractured environment, even the smallest suggestion of betrayal struck a nerve. Gossip became a weapon, a way of reinforcing boundaries and drawing lines between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Nurses and guards were caught in the middle of this cultural struggle, their daily lives serving as unwilling reflections of Italy's wider fears. The consequences were not just reputational, but emotional, leaving scars that lingered long after the war's end. Imagine a marketplace in a small Italian town. Women trade vegetables under a canopy of dust and sun, while men stand nearby discussing the progress of the war. In quiet voices, someone mentions the nurses at the hospital, recounting stories that may or may not be true. Heads nod, tongues click in disapproval, and suddenly a private suspicion becomes public judgment. In this way, rumor seeped into every corner of daily life. It shaped how people viewed one another, how they measured loyalty, and how they defined their place in a nation caught between devastation and recovery. The wider consequences of these whispers were not limited to the war years, but became part of the social memory of an entire generation. As the war dragged on and Italy remained a land of uncertainty, the rumors about the nurses and U.S. Guards reached their peak. What had begun as faint whispers now became a constant undercurrent in the lives of those involved. Nurses who had once been respected without question now carried the shadow of scandal wherever they went. Every look, every small kindness was twisted into evidence. The climax of this story was not a violent confrontation, but rather a silent trial held in the court of public opinion. The nurses' reputations hung in the balance, judged not by truth, but by the persistence of gossip. This was the moment when perception and reality were pulled farthest apart. Inside the hospitals, the reality was exhaustion, service, and sacrifice. Nurses continued their endless routines of cleaning wounds, administering morphine, and comforting men who were far from home. The guards, meanwhile, fulfilled their orders to protect these fragile spaces, keeping watch for unrest or danger. Yet outside those walls, people told themselves another story. They spoke of secret romances, of betrayals hidden in plain sight, of women surrendering not to necessity, but to temptation. The contrast between what was imagined and what was lived could not have been greater. For the nurses, the weight of this climax was unbearable. They were powerless to control the stories told about them, powerless to prove their innocence to a community that preferred suspicion to fact. Imagine finishing a shift where you had watched a young soldier die in your arms, only to walk home and feel the eyes of neighbors follow you with quiet judgment. The silence of those around you was louder than accusations spoken aloud. Their compassion, their fatigue, and their sacrifice were invisible, eclipsed by tales that bore no connection to their truth. In this way, the climax of their ordeal was not a single event, but the steady accumulation of shame they did not deserve. The guards, too, found themselves trapped in this narrative. They had not come to Italy to inspire gossip, yet their very presence was enough to provoke it. Every nod, every polite gesture was reshaped into something it was not. They stood watch with their rifles, but could not defend themselves against the suspicions of a community that wanted both their protection and their distance. It was a paradox that no amount of discipline could resolve. To be close was to be suspected, to be distant was to be resented. At the height of the rumors, their role as both liberators and strangers became painfully clear. In many ways, this climax revealed the war's deeper cruelty. It was not only about the destruction of cities or the loss of lives. It was about the corrosion of trust, the way suspicion could poison even the most innocent interactions. Italy's hospitals, meant to be havens of healing, became instead places where whispers held as much power as scalpel and syringe. The climax was not marked by explosions or gunfire, but by the heavy silence of reputations destroyed and relationships strained. It was a reminder that in war, the battlefield is everywhere, even in the spaces that should remain untouched by conflict. When the guns finally fell silent and Italy began the long process of rebuilding, the rumors did not disappear overnight. The war had left visible scars on cities and fields, but it had also left invisible scars on those who lived through it. For the nurses, the whispers followed them long after the wounded had gone home, and the American guards had returned to their posts elsewhere. Their service had been vital, their sacrifices immense, yet their reputations remained tied to suspicions they had never been able to control. The legacy of these rumors became part of their personal histories, etched into the memory of their communities, even when the war itself faded into the past. For the U.S. Guards, the experience revealed a different truth. They were remembered not only as protectors, but also as figures who stirred unease. To some Italians, they represented liberation, the men who had helped push back the chaos of war. To others, they remained symbols of intrusion, foreign soldiers whose presence reshaped the rhythms of local life. In both cases, their interactions with the nurses became part of how they were remembered. They had become unwilling participants in a narrative of suspicion, a reminder that victory on the battlefield did not erase the complexities of human relationships. At a broader level, these stories illuminated the fragile state of trust in wartime. Italy had endured years of shifting allegiances, and its people had learned to question even their closest neighbors. The rumors about nurses and guards reflected this wider climate of doubt. They were less about individuals and more about the struggle of a nation to define loyalty and morality in a time of upheaval. What emerged was a cautionary tale about how quickly reputations can be reshaped by fear, and how communities in crisis can impose burdens on those who had already given so much. The hospitals became not only places of healing, but also mirrors of a society fractured by war. Imagine walking those hospital halls years later, when the war was over and the wards were quiet. The echo of footsteps on the tiled floors would still carry memories of a time when every gesture was judged, when every smile might be misread. For the women who had once worked there, those walls held more than stories of patience and recovery. They held the weight of suspicion, of dignity questioned, of service overshadowed by rumor. Their legacy was complicated, both honored and doubted, both respected and whispered about. It was a legacy written not only in medical records, but in the collective memory of their communities. In the end, the story of the nurses and the guards is less about romance and more about the power of perception. It shows us that war does not only destroy cities and armies, it also reshapes how people see one another. Trust becomes fragile, suspicion becomes strong, and those caught in the middle bear the heaviest burdens. The nurses of Italy carried those burdens quietly, their service remembered in two conflicting ways, as acts of compassion and as subjects of scandal. The true legacy of their story lies in that tension, a reminder that even in the shadows of war, the fight for dignity can be as fierce as any battle.